My beloved child. There is a reason these words found you. At this particular moment. Maybe you almost kept scrolling. Maybe you were distracted. Maybe you have been carrying a question in your heart that you have not even known how to put into words. And yet, here you are. So before you decide that this is just another message, pause for a moment. There is something you may have misunderstood about the season you are living through. What if the blessing you have been asking God to reveal is not simply something waiting for you in the future? What if God has already been preparing you to recognize it? Sometimes the most important moments do not arrive with noise. They appear quietly, in the middle of an ordinary day, while your heart is still trying to understand what the last season meant. Perhaps you thought you were behind. Perhaps you wondered why other people seemed to be moving forward while your own life felt strangely still. But what if stillness was not abandonment? What if the delay was not proof that you had been forgotten? What if this moment is teaching you to see your life through a different lens? Scripture says in Psalm 139 that you are wonderfully made and that your days were known by God. That does not mean every event in your life was individually planned in a way that removes human choice or hardship. It means your existence has value. Your life has meaning. You are not an accident in the eyes of God. And maybe that truth is exactly where this message needs to begin. Think about how many moments in your life seemed insignificant when they happened. A conversation you almost avoided. A person you almost never met. A decision you made at the last minute. A door that closed and forced you to take another route. A morning when you woke up with no idea that something small would eventually change the direction of your life. We rarely recognize turning points while we are standing inside them. We recognize them later. Years afterward, we look back and say, now I understand why that happened. But while we were living through it, we were simply trying to make it through the day. Maybe you are standing in one of those moments right now. You may not recognize it because nothing about today looks extraordinary. There may be no dramatic sign in front of you. No announcement. No obvious proof that anything is changing. Yet something can be developing beneath the surface while everything appears ordinary. A seed does not look like a tree. A beginning does not always look like a breakthrough. And preparation often looks remarkably similar to waiting. That is why you should not judge the value of your current season only by what you can see. There was a woman who had become convinced that she had missed her moment. She watched people around her accomplish things she once dreamed about, and she quietly began comparing her life to theirs. She did not resent them. She was genuinely happy for them. But every celebration reminded her of something she felt she had not received. One evening, she sat alone at her kitchen table after a long day. The room was quiet. A small light above the table illuminated an old notebook she had not opened in years. She almost put it away. Instead, she opened it. Inside were pages she had written during a completely different season of her life. Dreams. Prayers. Ideas. Things she had forgotten she once cared about. As she turned the pages, she realized something unexpected. Some of those dreams had not disappeared. They had simply changed shape. The person who wrote those words years earlier had been focused on what she wanted to receive. The woman reading them now understood that what mattered most was what she could become and what she could give. Her unanswered prayers had not produced the life she originally imagined. They had produced a deeper person. And suddenly, she wondered whether the blessing she had been waiting for had been forming inside her long before she knew how to recognize it. Maybe something similar is happening in you. Perhaps you have been measuring God's goodness by one specific outcome. You prayed for one door, one opportunity, one relationship, one answer, one change. And because that particular thing has not happened exactly as you imagined, you assumed nothing was happening. But God is not limited to the form of the answer you expected. Sometimes the answer begins as a change in your perspective. Sometimes it begins with a new desire. Sometimes it begins with the courage to release something you once thought you could never live without. Sometimes it begins when you finally realize that your identity cannot depend on whether a particular prayer is answered in the way you imagined. And that can be a blessing too. Not because disappointment suddenly becomes pleasant, but because your heart becomes freer. You stop trying to control the outcome and begin trusting the one who knows more than you do. Jesus often met people in ordinary places and gave their ordinary moments extraordinary meaning. He met fishermen beside a lake. He spoke with people on roads, in homes, at tables, near wells. Their lives were not always polished or impressive. Yet an encounter with Jesus changed how they saw themselves and their future. That is important for you to remember. You do not need to be standing in a perfect place for God to begin something meaningful. You do not need a perfect past. You do not need to have every question answered. You do not need to feel spiritually strong every day. You can meet Jesus in the middle of confusion. You can seek Him in the middle of uncertainty. You can bring Him the parts of your life that still feel unfinished. Maybe the blessing for you begins there, not with receiving everything you want, but with discovering that you were never walking alone. And there is something else you need to understand about being not here by accident. It does not mean every random event is a secret message from heaven. It means you can choose to meet this moment with purpose. You can stop treating your present circumstances as meaningless. You can ask, Jesus, what can you teach me here? Who can I become here? Who can I encourage here? What can I learn here? Those questions transform the way you experience ordinary life. A difficult season can still contain growth. A quiet season can still contain preparation. An unexpected season can still contain purpose. You may not control everything that happens around you, but you can choose how you respond. And sometimes that choice becomes the beginning of the blessing. Maybe you have been asking God for a sign because you are afraid of making the wrong decision. But perhaps what you need is not a spectacular sign. Perhaps you need wisdom. Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6 teaches us to trust the Lord rather than leaning entirely on our own understanding and to acknowledge Him in our ways. That means you can move carefully without being paralyzed. You can pray without obsessing. You can seek counsel without surrendering your judgment. You can make a decision without pretending you know the entire future. Faith does not mean having every answer. Faith means refusing to let the absence of every answer convince you that God is absent. So look at your life again. Look at the thing you almost gave up on. Look at the ability you have ignored. Look at the opportunity you dismissed because it seemed too small. Look at the lesson you gained from something you once considered a failure. Look at the person you have become through everything you have walked through. Maybe you are seeing these things differently now. And perhaps that is the first part of the blessing. Because before God changes what is around you, He may change what you can see. The same situation can look completely different when your perspective changes. The same closed door can become a lesson instead of a rejection. The same waiting period can become preparation instead of punishment. The same ordinary day can become an opportunity instead of something to rush through. You may have clicked on this message expecting to hear that something wonderful is about to happen. But maybe the deeper message is this. Something wonderful can begin when you stop believing that your life has been meaningless simply because it has not unfolded according to your timeline. Your story is still being written. And the part you are living right now may contain something you will only understand much later, so do not rush past this moment. Do not dismiss your life because it looks ordinary. Do not compare your chapter with someone else's highlight. And do not assume that silence means God has stopped working. Perhaps the blessing is closer to you than you think, but before you can recognize it, you need to understand why the season behind you mattered. Because there is a reason certain things had to teach you what they taught you. And when you finally see that reason, you may realize that what you thought was taking you away from your blessing was actually preparing you to receive it differently. There is a moment in almost every journey when the meaning of the past begins to change. Not because the past itself changes, but because you finally understand something you could not see while you were living through it. The conversation you thought was pointless suddenly becomes important. The rejection you thought had ended everything becomes the reason you discovered another path. The season you called empty becomes the season that gave you the strength you needed. And perhaps you are approaching one of those moments now. You may not have all the evidence yet, but something inside you is beginning to recognize that your story cannot be measured by the chapters that did not go according to plan. Consider the person who spends years believing that one particular opportunity was their only chance. They build their confidence around it. They imagine their future around it. They pray for it. Then, unexpectedly, it disappears. For a while, they cannot understand why God would allow something they worked so hard for to slip away. They replay every decision. They wonder what they did wrong. They question whether they misunderstood God's direction. But months later, they discover another path. It begins with something much smaller than the opportunity they lost. It does not look impressive. It does not give them the immediate recognition they once wanted. Yet it introduces them to people, experiences, and responsibilities that slowly reshape their future. One day they look back and realize something painful but freeing. They had been asking God to restore an old plan while God was teaching them to recognize a new one. Maybe you have been doing the same thing. Maybe you have been asking God to give you back what you lost, when He may be teaching you how to receive something different. That does not mean the loss did not matter. It mattered. You are allowed to miss what you hoped would happen. You are allowed to grieve a dream. You are allowed to admit that something hurt. Faith does not require you to pretend that disappointment never happened. But there comes a time when grief has to stop becoming a permanent address. You can honor what was without refusing what may still be possible. Isaiah 43 carries a powerful picture of God doing something new and calling His people to recognize it. The message is not that the past had no value. It is that God is not limited to repeating the past. And perhaps that is what your heart needs to hear. Your next blessing may not resemble your previous blessing. Your next opportunity may not arrive through the same person. Your next season may not look anything like the one you imagined. If you insist that God must answer you in exactly the way you expected, you may overlook the answer because it arrives wearing a different shape. That is why comparison can become so exhausting. You see someone else's life and unconsciously create a blueprint for your own. You see their relationship, their career, their home, their success, their confidence, their opportunities, and you begin wondering why your life does not look the same. But God did not create you to live someone else's story. Their timing is not your timing. Their assignment is not your assignment. Their path may contain things you will never experience, and your path may contain things they could never understand. You do not need to become jealous of another person's blessing to recognize that God can bless you differently. Your blessing may be quieter. It may be deeper. It may take longer. It may require preparation nobody else can see. And it may eventually reveal why your journey had to be different. Think about a house being built. If you only watch from the outside, there are long periods when it appears that nothing is happening. The walls may look unfinished. The ground may be covered in dirt. Materials may be stacked everywhere. There is no beauty yet. But beneath the surface, workers are creating the foundation. Nobody living in the finished house will admire the foundation because it remains hidden. Yet without it, the beautiful structure could not stand. Some seasons of your life may feel like that. Hidden. Unimpressive. Slow. But hidden does not mean useless. Perhaps God has been strengthening something beneath the surface that will support what comes later. Maybe your patience has been developing. Maybe your character has been refined. Maybe your ability to recognize unhealthy patterns has grown. Maybe your relationship with Jesus has become more personal instead of being based only on what you can receive. Maybe you have learned how to be grateful without needing everything to be perfect. Maybe you have discovered that peace is not the same thing as having no problems. These changes may not receive applause. But they matter. And one day, when life becomes more demanding, you may realize that the quiet season gave you something you desperately needed. There is another reason your blessing may not look the way you expected. Sometimes what we call a blessing is actually an opportunity to serve. We naturally ask, what will this do for me? But Jesus often redirects our hearts toward another question. What can this do through me? If God gives you influence, how will you use it? If He gives you resources, how will you steward them? If He gives you wisdom, who will benefit from it? If He gives you a platform, will you use it only to be seen, or will you use it to point people towards something greater than yourself? The blessing becomes more meaningful when it becomes bigger than personal comfort. Maybe that is why your preparation has taken longer than you expected. You are not simply being prepared to receive. You are being prepared to carry. And carrying something valuable requires strength. A person can desire a larger responsibility while still needing to develop the character required to handle it. That is not rejection. That is preparation. Think about a young tree. You do not make it stronger by constantly protecting it from every breeze. Over time, exposure to ordinary conditions helps it develop strength. It grows gradually. Its roots deepen. Its branches become stronger. The process is slow, but the strength becomes part of the tree. Perhaps your life has been developing in a similar way. The pressure was not always pleasant. The waiting was not always comfortable. The unanswered questions were not always easy. But somewhere along the way, you became stronger. Not perfect. Not fearless. But stronger. And that matters. Because when the opportunity arrives, you will not be the same person who first prayed for it. You will bring lessons with you, you will bring discernment with you. You will bring humility with you. You will bring a deeper understanding of God's faithfulness with you. And maybe that is the part you have not recognized. You keep looking for evidence that God is preparing the blessing. But perhaps the evidence is already visible in the person you have become. Maybe you are more patient than you used to be. Maybe you forgive faster. Maybe you recognize what is not healthy for you. Maybe you no longer need everyone's approval. Maybe you can sit in silence without assuming that God has abandoned you. Maybe you have learned to pray even when your emotions are not cooperating. Those are not small changes. Those are signs of growth. And growth often comes before expansion. That is why you should not despise where you are simply because you are not where you want to be. You can desire more and still be grateful for now. You can believe that God has more for your life without becoming dissatisfied with today's assignment. You can hope for tomorrow without rejecting today. Philippians 4 reminds us to learn contentment in different circumstances. Contentment does not mean giving up on growth. It means your peace is no longer completely controlled by your circumstances. You can keep moving forward while remaining thankful for what God has already given you. There is a quiet moment that comes after you stop fighting the past. It may not happen all at once. Sometimes it happens slowly, almost without you noticing. One day, you realize you are no longer asking the same question every morning. You are no longer waking up wondering why someone else received what you prayed for. You are no longer measuring God's faithfulness by the speed of your circumstances. Something inside you has become quieter. Not because every problem disappeared, but because you finally understand that your peace cannot depend on having every answer. And perhaps that is where the next part of your story begins. Because when your heart is no longer consumed by what you think you are missing, you become capable of recognizing what is already in front of you. Maybe the blessing is not hidden because God wants to keep it from you. Maybe you have simply been looking for it in a place where you expected it to appear. Imagine someone walking through a familiar neighborhood at sunset. They have walked the same streets hundreds of times. They know every corner, every tree, every house. But one evening, the sunlight falls differently. A golden glow touches a building they had never really noticed before. The building was always there. Nothing about it had suddenly appeared. What changed was the way they saw it. That simple image can describe certain seasons of faith. Sometimes God does not immediately change the landscape. He changes your eyes. The opportunity may have been near you for months. The person who encourages you may already be in your life. The gift you have been asking for may already exist in a small form. The lesson you need may already be sitting inside an experience you keep wishing had never happened. The beginning may already be present, but because it does not look like the finished picture in your imagination, you overlook it. That is why gratitude can become such a powerful spiritual practice. Gratitude does not deny what is missing. It helps you see what is present. When you thank God for the things you already have, your heart becomes less controlled by what you do not have. You begin noticing the small mercies that were invisible when you were focused entirely on the next big answer. A peaceful morning. A person who still cares. Another opportunity to begin. The ability to learn. The strength to keep going. The simple fact that your story has not ended. Lamentations 3 speaks about God's mercies being new each morning. Think about that. New every morning. Not because every morning will be easy, but because God's faithfulness is not exhausted by yesterday. Maybe you need to hear that today. Yesterday does not have to become a prophecy about tomorrow. The mistake you made does not have to define your future. The door that closed does not have to become the only door you ever see. The season that disappointed you does not have to determine the size of your hope. There is still room for God to surprise you. But perhaps the surprise will not look like what you imagined. A few years ago, someone might have told you that your greatest blessing would come through the exact situation you were praying for. Maybe you would have believed them. But now you may understand something deeper. A blessing can be a new perspective. A healthy boundary. A restored relationship with God. A stronger character. A clearer purpose. A chance to serve. A peaceful heart. A second opportunity to do something differently. A lesson that prevents you from repeating an old pattern. These things may not make impressive headlines, but they can completely transform a life. And this is where the title becomes more personal. You're not here by accident. Those words do not mean that every moment of your life has been easy or that every circumstance was caused by God. They mean that this moment can still become meaningful. You can choose to listen. You can choose to seek Jesus. You can choose to let this message challenge something inside you. You can choose to stop treating your life as though it is waiting for permission to become valuable. Your life already matters. Your prayers matter. Your choices matter. The way you treat people matters. The way you respond to disappointment matters. The way you handle success matters. And perhaps the blessing is connected to all of it. There is a story in the Gospels that reveals something important about Jesus. A man named Zacchaeus climbed a tree because he wanted to see Jesus as he passed by. He was not standing in a place of honor. He was not surrounded by religious leaders. He was simply a man trying to see over the crowd. Yet Jesus noticed him. Jesus called him by name and entered his home. The encounter changed Zacchaeus from the inside out. The blessing was not merely that Jesus saw him. The blessing was that being seen by Jesus led him toward transformation. Maybe that is what you need. Not simply to receive something from God, but to realize that Jesus sees you. He sees the part of your story that nobody else knows. He sees the prayer you stopped talking about because you became tired of explaining it. He sees the dream you buried because you thought it was too late. He sees the disappointment you smiled through. He sees the strength you had to develop because life did not always give you a choice. And he sees the person you are becoming. That does not mean every desire will be fulfilled exactly as you imagine. But it does mean your life is not invisible, and when you understand that, something changes. You stop begging for proof that you matter. You begin living from the truth that you do. You stop chasing every opportunity because you are desperate to feel significant. You begin asking which opportunities align with your purpose. You stop trying to force people to recognize your value. You begin trusting that your value is not determined by their recognition. You stop treating every delay as a punishment. You begin asking what the delay might be teaching you. That is a completely different way to live. And perhaps there is one more thing you need to release before the blessing can be fully appreciated. The need for the blessing to look impressive. We live in a culture that celebrates visible success. Bigger numbers. Bigger houses. Bigger careers. Bigger platforms. Bigger achievements. But God is not limited by what looks impressive from the outside. Some of the most important blessings in your life may never be visible to strangers. Peace can be invisible. Character can be invisible. Wisdom can be invisible. Forgiveness can be invisible. A renewed relationship with God can be invisible. But these things can change everything. Maybe you have been praying for a life that looks different when God is preparing a heart that feels different. Maybe the external change will come later. Maybe it will not come in the form you expected. But the internal transformation is already valuable. And when you begin to understand that, you become much harder to discourage. Because your hope is no longer attached to one outcome. Your hope is attached to God. That is what makes Christian hope different from wishful thinking. Wishful thinking says, I hope everything happens exactly the way I want. Biblical hope says, I trust God even when I cannot control how the story unfolds. That kind of hope can survive uncertainty. It can survive waiting. It can survive disappointment. And it can also survive success. Because when the blessing comes, you will not forget where your hope belongs. So perhaps tonight, instead of asking God only for the thing you want, ask Him to help you recognize what He is already doing. Ask for eyes that notice. A heart that listens. Wisdom that discerns. Courage that moves when movement is right. Patience that waits when waiting is necessary. And humility that remembers where every good gift comes from. James 1 reminds us that every good and perfect gift comes from above. The verse points our attention back to the giver. That matters because blessings become dangerous to our hearts when we become more fascinated with the gift than with God. You do not want to spend your whole life chasing a blessing and then discover that the chase pulled you away from the one you were praying to. You want the blessing to bring you closer to Jesus. You want success without losing your soul. You want opportunity without losing your integrity. You want abundance without losing gratitude. You want influence without losing humility. You want a new chapter without forgetting the lessons of the old one. And perhaps that is why your preparation has been so personal. God may be preparing not only what you will receive, but how you will carry it. That distinction is easy to miss. But it can change everything. Because maybe the question is no longer, when will my blessing arrive? Maybe the question is, who am I becoming while I wait? And if you can answer that honestly, you may discover that your story has already changed. You are not the same person who began praying for this. You have learned. You have grown. You have endured. You have discovered things about yourself. You have discovered things about God. And perhaps the person you are becoming is already part of the blessing you were asking for. There is still more to understand. Because if you truly are not here by accident, then this moment carries a responsibility. Not to predict the future. Not to chase signs. Not to force circumstances. But to live this day with purpose. To stop waiting for your real life to begin. To stop believing that God's purpose only exists in some distant future. Your purpose can be expressed today. In the way you speak. In the way you forgive. In the way you work. In the way you love. In the way you serve. In the way you trust Jesus when nobody else knows what you are carrying. And perhaps that is where the blessing begins to become real. Not when everything changes around you. But when something changes within you. And when that happens, you may look at your life one day and realize something you could never see before. You were not wandering through random chapters. You were learning how to recognize the story God was still writing. And the most important part may be closer than you think. That my beloved child, before you move on from this message, remember what you may have almost missed. You are not here because your life is perfect. You are not here because every prayer has already been answered. You are here because God can meet you in the middle of an unfinished story and remind you that unfinished does not mean forgotten. Perhaps the blessing you have been waiting for is not something you need to chase. Perhaps it is something you need to recognize, receive with wisdom, and use with gratitude. Jesus never asked people to understand the entire road before taking the next faithful step. He simply called them to follow him. So take the next step you can see. Release the pressure to understand everything. Let yesterday remain yesterday. Let tomorrow remain in God's hands. And let today become an opportunity to trust again. Maybe this is the moment you stop saying, "Nothing is happening," and start saying, "I may not see everything, but God is still working in ways I cannot measure." Maybe the blessing is a new opportunity. Maybe it is restored peace. Maybe it is wisdom. Maybe it is a relationship that brings healthy growth. Maybe it is a purpose you are finally brave enough to pursue. Whatever form it takes, do not let the desire for a certain outcome make you blind to the goodness already present in your life. Psalm 27 reminds us to wait for the Lord with courage and confidence. Waiting is not wasted when God is shaping your heart through it. So when you leave this message, do not carry the pressure to figure out your entire future tonight. Carry one simple truth instead: you are not here by accident. Your life has meaning. Your story still has pages left to be written. And whatever God brings into your life next, may you recognize it not merely as a blessing you received, but as an opportunity to walk closer with Jesus, grow deeper in faith, and become the person He is calling you to be. The chapter ahead may not look like the one you imagined. But perhaps, one day, you will look back and whisper, "Now I understand why I had to walk this road." And until that day comes, keep walking. Keep trusting. Keep your heart open. The story is not over.